Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed for my favorite video of the year, the monitor rankings. Today, I'll be ranking all 35 monitors that I've tested throughout 2025 into the usual tier list. Been doing this for a few years now. You guys seem to really enjoy it, so I'm back for more in 2025. Here's the tier list I'll be working with, of course, with S tier being the best and F tier being the worst. All of the monitors are over here ready to be slotted in. There's several pages of them, so it could take a while to work through everything. As is the case with our previous tier list videos, this isn't meant to be a recommendation guide or a review of each product. We've already got tons of that sort of content right here on the channel, including reviews for something like 95% of the displays I'll be talking about. Instead, it's purely a ranking video where we're going to be assessing each monitor based on factors like performance, features, and also the value that it's offered across the year. Now, when we talk about pricing, we are going to be focusing largely on the US market, but that's just one factor that goes into these rankings. It's really an assessment of the overall quality of each product. But before we get into that, a word from today's video sponsor.
Today's video is brought to you by Insta360 and their Link 2 4K webcam, now available in white. Building on the original Link, the Link 2 includes AI tracking for individuals and groups, auto framing, and auto gesture controls. For a webcam, it has fantastic autofocus with no focus pulsing, which is a major plus. It also now offers modes such as customizable backgrounds, adding versatility to every use case. The Link 2 is equipped with a gimbal, making it perfect for presentations, meetings, group calls, and any situation where you might be moving around. The 4K 30fps sensor offers excellent performance even in low light situations, and you can really only get better performance out of something like a digital SLR camera. With various AI features and a user-friendly desktop app, achieving the perfect presentation's a breeze. It also pairs perfectly with the new Wave speakerphone, so for more information, please click the links in the video description.
So first up, we've got the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27UCDM, and this was the first monitor that we tested in the year to use a 27-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED panel. And it really is the ultimate monitor with those specifications. It includes all of Asus's usual features that they're now offering, things like the Neo proximity sensor, black frame insertion, OLED anti-flicker, but it complemented this with their high-end feature set, which includes DisplayPort 2.1 and Dolby Vision support. It also had great performance across a wide range of categories, as well as all the usual good stuff that we see from QD OLED panels, black depths, HDR performance, fast response times, as well as the flaws from QD OLED panels as well, like the screen coating, as well as the annoying issues with panel dimming in bright HDR scenes. Now, normally I would say that a product that ticks all the boxes in terms of features and performance would be an S-tier monitor, but the one thing that holds this product back, I think, is the price. This was a very expensive product throughout most of 2025, around the $1,200 to $1,100 US mark, which was much more expensive than a lot of the other 4K QD OLEDs that we assessed. So I think that holds it back from being an S-tier product and probably keeps it in the A tier for now. But of course, if you did want the best of the best, this probably is that. Next up is the MSI MPG27FFX2A. So this is another 27-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED, very similar to the Asus model, but without some of the features that the Asus offers. So no anti-flicker mode, no proximity sensor, no Dolby Vision support, but it did include DisplayPort 2.1. It was a similar price to the Asus model for most of this year, making it relatively poor value at around $1,100 US. If you're going to spend that much money, you may as well just buy the Asus model because it had better features. It has dropped down more recently to below $1,000, which makes it more competitive. But again, for most of the year, it was relatively poor value. But at the same time, it's not a bad monitor. It's a very good quality screen. So I think that probably puts it into the B tier for now. Next up, we have the Gigabyte M32UP. This is a perfectly fine 4K 32-inch 160Hz IPS LCD with a good balance of performance. It has fantastic color accuracy, suitable brightness, great resolution, of course being a 4K panel at 32 inches. That's a great size for productivity, along with things like solid response times with functional variable overdrive. It doesn't really do anything special for a 32-inch 4K LCD though, didn't really accelerate that category in any meaningful way, no HDR support either, and had limited availability with OK value. So based on that, I think it's a pretty average monitor. I don't think it deserves to go into the D tier because it's a product that I would recommend if you are after a 32-inch 4K LCD, but I don't think it does anything special to elevate it up into, say, the B, A, or S tiers. Next up, we've got the Dell Alienware AW2725Q. So this is a 4K 240Hz QD OLED panel at 27 inches in size. And again, very similar to the Asus and MSI models that we've already talked about, but with fewer features. So for example, no DisplayPort 2.1 on this model. It did include Dolby Vision support and eARC. eARC was sort of an exclusive to this monitor if that's something that you wanted. I really liked the design. I thought it had a great design for a monitor, but it's not as well calibrated as the Asus model. Still good, but not quite as good as that product. The reason why I would personally put it into the A tier is because it was much cheaper than the Asus model for most of this year at around $900 US, making an excellent value. So if you were going to choose one of these 4K models and you didn't necessarily want the best of the best features, the Dell model made a lot of sense and was a product that I've ultimately recommended in some of the guides that we've produced throughout this year. So great product, definitely worthy of being in the A tier. Then we get to the MSI MAG271QPX-E2. So this is a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz QD OLED, one of several released throughout this year that ultimately offered pretty good value at varying points. So of course, budget-oriented QD OLED here, still high quality though, not as well calibrated as the flagship MSI models, most of which were usually 360Hz. And of course, it packed the usual QD OLED flaws, so things like the screen coding, panel dimming and brighter HDR scenes, the usual stuff. And it did have some cutbacks to things like USB ports to hit a lower price point. It typically sold for about $600 US, which was pretty good value across the year, and it fell to below $500 during September, making it very good value as far as those 1440p QD OLEDs go. So again, it's not really doing anything special for me, and the pricing isn't as good as we've seen from some of the monitors that we'll be talking about later throughout this rankings, I would imagine. So for the moment, I think that probably puts it into the B tier as well. Great product, definitely worth buying, but not doing enough to get into the A and S tiers for now. But of course, we can re-rank things a bit later if necessary. An interesting monitor comes up next, a bit different to the ones we've been talking about, the Titan Army P2510S. So this is unusual, being a 24-inch 1440p 240Hz IPS LCD. So unique size there. If you did want 1440p resolution at a smaller panel size, this is the monitor to get. It does have terrible build quality, which I think does bring it down the rankings a bit, but it made up for that with a lot of its panel performance characteristics. So it offered variable overdrive, for example, good response time performance, accurate SDR colors, average uniformity and contrast, brightness, all the usual sorts of things you see from an IPS LCD. Typically, it was quite cheap throughout the year, being priced below $300 US, which is a pretty good price for a high refresh rate 1440p LCD. But again, I don't think it's doing anything special. This is a pretty average monitor. It's not something I'd be recommending to a lot of people unless you were specifically after the 24-inch size. So I think that makes it a C-tier monitor. If I'm thinking about, is this a highly flawed product that would put into the D tier? As I mentioned, the build quality isn't amazing, but I don't think that's enough to put into the D tier, given that it was quite strong in terms of panel performance and other characteristics. Next up, we have the MSI MPG27FFX2A. This is a 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED that was very similar to the 321URX that we reviewed in 2024, except this time it's been released and updated with DisplayPort 2.1, which in my opinion is not a necessary inclusion for monitors necessarily. With the latest GPUs, the Blackwell series from NVIDIA, as well as the latest products from AMD, you don't actually need DisplayPort 2.1 to get the full functionality of this monitor. They work just fine with DisplayPort 1.4 plus DSC. Now, of course, with DisplayPort 2.1, you get the ability to use this without DSC over the UHBR20 spec if you really want to. But as I said, I don't think that's a necessary thing, and it's not something I believe is worth paying a premium for. And this is where the real downfall of the 322URX begins. For most of this year, this monitor was priced at $1,300 US, which was much more expensive than the 321URX, which you could usually find for about $950. So it certainly wasn't worth paying $350 US to access DisplayPort 2.1. That made it ludicrously expensive. Now, the MSRP has come down in the last couple of months to $1,100, and it's finally dropped to around $950 during Black Friday. But I think what this panel has offered throughout most of the year, most of what I've seen, made it exceptionally poor value and not worth recommending. It's not a bad monitor. So to get that clear, if you did purchase one of these products, works perfectly fine. It could have been good value in your region, but I think the price was such an issue with this monitor that I have to put it into the D tier, but it escapes the E and F tier because it's still a very functional 4K QD OLED that ultimately does deliver a great gaming experience. Next up is a monitor that I tested but didn't produce a review on, the Asrock PG27FFX2A. This is a 27-inch 1080p 520Hz IPS LCD. And the reason I didn't fully review this monitor is that there's nothing really exciting about it. It's a very average product overall, And it's not especially well tuned for 520Hz gaming, which is the real reason that you'd buy a 520Hz IPS LCD to access that performance. So generally speaking, if I was going to recommend a high-performance LCD with a high refresh rate for esports gamers, for example, I think I'd largely be sticking to the TN monitors. And for a lot of the year, this was quite an expensive product as well. It did fall to below $350 in the middle of the year, but I just don't think that's a particularly great price for 1080p 520Hz. So at best, I think I'd probably put this into the E tier. Just nothing amazing, not something I can recommend, not a great price, nothing really going for it. Next up, we have the Asus ROG Strix OLED Xg27UC DMG. So this is a 27-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED, the lower cost variant of the PG27 UCDM. And one of the great things about this monitor was that it's basically the same as the PG model, except it stripped out DisplayPort 2.1 and Dolby Vision, which are not really essential features for PC gaming. They're, of course, benefits and nice to have, but not essential. So for a lot of people, you could save a bit of money going for the XG model and get largely the same experience as the PG model, including things like the Neo Proximity Sensor, OLED Anti-Flicker, and all the other Asus features that they're currently offering with their monitors. Now, I think if they were able to stick to the $900 US price point that I was told when I reviewed it across the entirety of 2025, this probably would have been an S-tier monitor just because of the value it would have offered. It would have been quite similarly priced to the Dell model, but ultimately a better product because of a better feature set. However, the reality was that for a lot of the year, it was $975, and I believe that is still currently the price. So that did make it a bit less competitive than the Dell model. It still made it cheaper than the PG model by $100, a little bit more than $100, depending on the time that you look at it, but less competitive than the Alienware. So I think based on that, I would put it probably into the A tier. Now, whether I'd put it ahead of the Alienware model or below it, I'm not 100% sure. That's probably something to assess maybe later in the video as we go through and have a look at all the A-tier monitors. It certainly is a very good product and probably the better buy in most situations than the PG27 UCDM. But of course, it has less of a feature set. So how do you rank that? Not 100% sure. Again, as I said, I think I probably would have ranked it at least at the top of A tier, if not S tier, if they did hit the price point that they said for most of the year. But again, wasn't quite the extremely great value product that I think I thought it would be when I reviewed it. Then we get to the LG 45GX950A, which I think is going to be a pretty hard monitor to rank. This is a 45-inch, I guess, 5120 by 2160 panel, 21 by 9 aspect ratio at 165 Hz using a WOLED panel. So this is an amazing ultra-wide monitor based on its size and resolution. 45 inches is super immersive, and with the 4K class resolution, it improved a lot of the pixel density and text quality issues that we saw from previous 45-inch OLED ultra-wides that were using the older 3440 by 1440 resolution. So a great monitor from that sense, really high-quality HDR experience, great performance from the WOLED panel, and it included useful things like dual mode support, 1080p 330Hz in this occasion. So if you did want a premium ultra-wide monitor, I would certainly be recommending this. Like, it's a great product, really, but also it, I guess, fell short of being the ultimate 45-inch monitor that I was looking for, which probably would have seen it go into the S tier if LG did execute on some of the things that it didn't quite nail. So I'm thinking of the 800R curve, 2 curve for this screen. I think if they used a glossy screen coating instead of the matte coating, that would have been more appealing for this sort of monitor. And the fact that it was just 165 Hz, it's not a deal breaker for this monitor, given the high resolution makes it quite hard to run games at above 165 Hz, but you're talking about quite a premium display. So I think 240 Hz, which I believe is capable with this sort of panel, I think would have been a bit more well-suited to the category that they were going for here. It's also not a tandem WOLED, one of the newer types of panels. So while the performance is still good, it's not quite at the current tier that we're seeing from, say, the 1440p models. Another factor that sort of works against the LG 45GX950A was the price tag. It debuted at $2,000 US, which is extremely expensive. And while sales in the last couple of months have brought it down to $1,600 and $1,500, it's still the most expensive product that I'll be ranking today. And with some of those issues that I was talking about, the refresh rate curve, screen coating, that sort of thing, again, it's like, if you wanted a premium monitor, I'd probably recommend it, but it's not as good as it could have been. And I feel like they will be updating this soon with some of those additional benefits. Chiefly, there is supposed to be a motorized curve version, which would allow you to set the curve to the sort of aspect that you would want. I think a lot of people would set it to more like 1800R instead of 800R, but that model still hasn't been released as far as I'm aware. So I guess you're currently stuck with this. So I think that probably puts it into the B tier based on what I've been saying so far. If we look at the C tier, for example, that's an average monitor, and the 45GX950A is better than average. But to get into like A or S tier, it really has to be outstanding across more categories than it is. So I think B tier probably makes sense. However, I would put it above the other two B tier products that we've been talking about so far. So it is probably a little better than the 272URX, which was expensive and not worth recommending over the other products. 271QPX, again, great value product, worth recommending at some points. Whereas the 45GX950A is kind of an exclusive in some ways. You don't see a lot of other monitors doing what this product does. So I think at the top of the B tier, that's a good position for this product to lie. Then we get the Samsung Odyssey OLED G81SF, and I tested the 32-inch version of this monitor. So it's a 4K 240Hz QD OLED, lots of OLEDs towards the start of this year. Pretty standard 32-inch 4K QD OLED experience, nothing crazily different about this product. It is reasonably well calibrated, but not top tier like you'd see from, say, the Asus model that we reviewed last year. It did have a simplified OSD interface compared to previous Odyssey OLEDs, which I liked. You don't get the smart TV functionality, but it is a lot more simple to navigate, probably a bit better for a desktop PC experience. The main differentiating factor that Samsung offers with this is, first of all, the design, which I think is quite nice with its silver finish, nice and slim. So that is unique if you did want that specific, I guess, design for a monitor, as well as it did offer a matte screen coating, which for some people is going to be a negative compared to the glossy finishes that you see across the majority of other 32-inch 4K QD OLEDs, but it offers a point of difference. So for example, if you did really want a matte finish, the Samsung model is the model to get. It didn't really complement this with features though. So no DisplayPort 2.1, no Dolby Vision, no USB-C. Doesn't make it one of the top tier products in terms of features. And it did have an absurd MSRP of $1,300 US. So similar sort of price to the 322URX. But again, didn't have as good feature set as that monitor. No DisplayPort 2.1 to even justify that high price. And another, I guess, thing that works against this monitor was that sales only have started to bring it down below $1,000 US. It is currently available for $800, which is a great price. But for most of the year, you're sort of looking at $1,300, $1,200, $1,000 most of the time. And if you were going to buy a 32-inch 4K QD OLED, I think you probably would have been better off with one of the, say, MSI models that were available around $900. So from that sense, I feel like this is another case of it being a D-tier product. Is it better than the 322URX? Maybe not, because of its absurd price for a lot of the year. It was a better price in some regions, to be fair. But also, then again, like the matte screen coating, would I be going to people and saying, buy this one if everything was the same price? Probably not. I'd probably be recommending maybe the MSI model, maybe the PG32 CDM, those sorts of products. So yeah, I think maybe D tier or maybe C tier. Maybe D tier is a bit too harsh. You can let me know in the comments below. But I think pricing was a pretty significant concern in the US for that particular product. Now we get to one of the most disappointing monitors of the year, the LG 27G850A. I had high hopes for this product because it was a 27-inch 4K 240Hz IPS LCD. And we don't often see 240Hz 4K monitors at this sort of size with an LCD panel. So theoretically, this could have offered a nice alternative to OLED for people that wanted a high refresh rate, they wanted a 27-inch 4K panel, but didn't want to deal with burn-in concerns, which would have potentially made it great for productivity use cases as well as gaming. It also offered IPS black, which boosted the contrast ratio compared to typical IPS LCDs. Most 27-inch 4K monitors around 1,000 to 1. I think this monitor is around 2,000 to 1. I think I tested it maybe a little below that, 1,800 to 1 or something like that, but certainly better than a lot of other IPS monitors. There were a few things going for it, had decent color accuracy. However, lots of issues with this monitor. The first one being bad response time tuning, much slower than other IPS LCDs. So you're not getting the same speed that you would see from a 27-inch 4K 160Hz monitor, for example. It also had terrible HDR performance because it had just 8 edge-lit dimming zones, so it really wasn't an HDR-capable product. The 480Hz dual mode, nice additional feature, but didn't work overly well considering the response time speed issues. And in my opinion, the MSRP, which was $900 US for this monitor, was absolutely absurd given what it offered. That was the same price as a lot of OLED alternatives. There's no way that you'd be purchasing this product for $900 when you could spend $900 or even less on something like the Alienware AW2725Q. that monitor is far superior to this LG, which makes it completely nonsensical in terms of the price. It did drop to $600 eventually, but still not an overly amazing price given its performance. So this is a pretty straightforward case of being an F-tier product in my opinion. Wouldn't recommend it. I think it didn't really deliver on its promises. But then, is F-tier meant for a broken monitor? It's not a broken display. You know, if you did want to use this primarily for productivity tasks, it has perfectly fine response time performance for productivity. So is it bottom of E tier? It might be bottom of E tier. Not 100% sure on where I'm going to put that one, but certainly nowhere above E. Cannot be justified above E for sure. Okay, next batch of monitors. We've got the Dell Alienware AW3425DW, an updated version of previous Dell ultrawides, but ultimately the same underlying panel tech, just boosted up to 240Hz. So 34-inch, 3440 by 1440, 21 by 9 aspect ratio, QD OLED, same performance as other QD OLEDs, but the same sort of flaws as well, especially the same sort of first generation QD OLED flaws that we saw originally. New and better design in my opinion, quite a nice color scheme, quite a nice overall design and build quality that Dell have used for these current monitors. When it debuted, the MSRP of $800 was okay. Certainly you could find some of the previous ultra-wide OLEDs at around a similar price. So I'm thinking 3423 DWF was available around that same sort of price. You could get it down at $650 during Black Friday, and its typical price is around $720 US. So not amazing in terms of pricing, but not overly crazy considering what a lot of other OLED ultrawides were selling for throughout this year, especially the 240Hz models. So from that standpoint, I think this is a pretty good product, but probably not anything above the B tier. If you came to me and you were asking for, hey, I want a 34-inch OLED ultrawide, I'd probably be recommending the Dell model across, compared to a lot of the other products I've tested. But is it amazing in the A tier or a superb product, S tier sort of thing? Not really. I think if this was an updated panel, you probably would have seen it in the A or S tier, fixing some of those first generation QD OLED problems. Next up, we have the MSI MAG272QP QD OLED X50. So 27-inch 1440p 500Hz QD OLED here, the first 500Hz QD OLED that I tested. So certainly the new refresh rate for this technology is compelling. It also brought with it higher QD OLED brightness, so reaching 300 nits full screen and 18% higher brightness in HDR tests, in addition to the 500Hz refresh rate, is quite nice. However, still issues with things like panel dimming. MSI tried to correct this through the EOTF boost mode, which works okay. Bit of a hack job considering they're still trying to fight the panel dimming issue, but ultimately it is a brighter monitor with a higher refresh rate. Decent calibration and tuning from MSI for this one. Now, I think one of the things that improves the X50 is the pricing situation. I was told $850 US when I reviewed it, but throughout a lot of this year, it's actually been priced at $750 US, making this one of the cheapest ways to access 500Hz OLED, cheaper than some of the 480Hz W OLEDs and the newer 540Hz W OLEDs as well. So if you wanted a really high refresh rate OLED monitor for competitive gaming, the 272QP X50 would be right up there with products that I would recommend. So based on that, I think it's probably an A tier product. Now, how I rank it amongst these monitors is complicated. Would I recommend it over an XG27UC DMG? I mean, probably not. These are all products that are definitely worth purchasing for various different reasons. So let's just leave it where it is for now, and we'll see how things go a bit later with re-rankings. The AOC Q27G40 XMN is next up. This is a 27-inch 1440p 180Hz VA LCD, but it does have true HDR capabilities thanks to a 1152 zone mini LED backlight. This is a generally upgraded version of the Q27G3 XMN. Not everything is upgraded, but it is generally better. So it has tighter dimming thanks to more dimming zones. It had less flickering, no pixel inversion, reduced dark smearing thanks to better response time optimizations, and of course, a great contrast ratio thanks to the VA LCD, but still has some of the flaws of the original model, like poor viewing angles. You still do get a little bit of dark smearing, and there were some emissions, reductions in performance, reductions in quality. So the height adjustable stand has been removed. This current stand that it offers is really crap with this model, downgraded DisplayPort functionality, and early units did have broken firmware with no way to easily update them, which is a bit problematic. I think that problem has likely been solved with the current models if you were purchasing one of them today. And in addition to all of these factors, it was pretty good value, $250 US for most of this year with limited availability at retailers. You couldn't get this in necessarily in all regions. does make this quite a complicated product. So if this was just a flat-out improvement on the Q27G3XMN, we'd probably be looking at an A-tier monitor or above. So for example, if it still had the height adjustable stand, if it had no firmware issues to begin with, and it just had all the upgrades at a $250 price point, A-tier monitor, the fact that it comes with a really crap stand and had the firmware issues, you know, it's still a good product that I'd recommend, but I think in this sort of tier, I'd be looking at B tier, somewhere around, you know, probably above the 272URX, considering that's not a monitor I would necessarily recommend depending on the price. The Q27G40XMN is easy to recommend. So I think I'd probably put it around that position. Yeah, probably not quite as good as the 45GX950A, which is, again, a product that was good but had issues as well. So yeah, let's slot it in there for now. Next, we have the Gigabyte M27UP, 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS LCD here, with very similar performance to other 4K 160Hz IPS LCDs. The key selling point with this monitor was the lower price point. So this was, when I was originally reviewing this monitor, I was told it would be $300 US, and it certainly is around that sort of price in some regions, but not in the US itself, where it's priced normally at $380, though current sales do put it closer to $300. So the main thing that you were getting with this monitor was the performance of other 4K IPS LCDs, but at a much lower price point than a lot of those other options, which typically were going for $400 to $500 US. So if you could get that same sort of thing for $300 US, absolutely amazing value, great entry point to 4K gaming. And considering that Gigabyte did do a good job of performance, single overdrive mode experience, variable overdrive, it has a 1080p 320Hz dual mode, solid color performance, good color calibration, acceptable contrast ratio. Because it had all those things, it's pretty easy to recommend. The fact that it is not $300 in the US and is actually $380 does dampen my expectations, my excitement for this product a little bit. But it's still strong value generally and would be one of the monitors that I would recommend. So I think this goes in the bottom of the A tier because 4K LCDs hitting below $400 US is something that wasn't a thing before the M27UP. So I think from that sense, I'd put it into the A tier. Now, if Gigabyte were able to hit that $300 US price point for most of this year, we probably would have been looking at an S tier monitor. Now, of course, it's not a QD OLED. It's not going to give you the overall best performance, but it's hard to go past a 4K LCD if it was $300 US. That would have been an amazing price. Next, we have the MSI MAG275QF. So this is a basic entry-level 1440p gaming monitor with a 27-inch 180Hz IPS LCD screen. Now, this isn't the best product. It has a crap fixed height stand with average build quality, no USB ports. It's an sRGB color gamut only monitor, mediocre uniformity and average brightness. But it does have decent calibration. Motion performance is similar to a lot of other 1440p LCDs that we've tested, and it's got a good resolution, better than 1080p in that sort of price range. The key feature here was that it's very cheap, typically $180 US, often seen as low as $150 US, which is an amazing price for this monitor. So the fact that it doesn't have an adjustable height stand, it doesn't have a wide color gamut, all those sorts of things, means it is still quite an average product. So I think ultimately it does belong in the C tier, but it is worth recommending for people after a low-cost monitor. So it is great from that sense, in which case it doesn't deserve to be in the D or E tiers. If this was a more expensive product, it would be going into those lower tiers. The Samsung Odyssey OLED G60SF is a 27-inch 1440p 500Hz QD OLED, so very similar to the 272QP X50 that we talked about earlier from MSI. Great SDR and HDR calibration on this display, wide range of OSD settings available. It does also offer a matte screen coating similar to the G81SF, so this is one of the ways that Samsung differentiates their QD OLEDs compared to other monitors. But because MSI has a directly competing glossy version, it does mean that you do get to choose between those two options. And I think a lot of people would ultimately choose the glossy version over matte. Though I think matte does make more sense on a product that is designed for esports competitive gaming, where you don't want to have distracting reflections on the screen while you're gaming. So matte does make a little bit more sense for that type of product and could make it worth purchasing. It does have an excellent design, very similar looking to the G81SF. Love that silver slim finish that you get. But like the G81SF, not the best feature set either. So no USB-C support, no DisplayPort 2.1, no Dolby Vision, not that the MSI model offers that either. I think the main issue here was that it was very expensive, $1,000 US as its MSRP, but it has fallen to $800 US since November, which makes it, more competitive with the 272QPX50, and it is currently $700, making it, I believe, the cheapest 500 Hz QD OLED on the market right now. Don't know if that sale price will continue. So those are promising signs, but it was $1,000 for quite a while, making it not as good value as the 272QPX50. So I think based on all those factors, it being not quite as good as this monitor and more expensive for most of the time, it's probably a B tier product. I think I'd put it above the 272URX and these other models that we've talked about. So somewhere in here, for example, would make the most sense to me, which means we have got quite a few B tier monitors and quite a few models to go. So we'll see, maybe we'll be clogging up the B tier with quite a few products. Next up, we have the Dell Alienware AW2725D. This is a 27-inch 1440p 280Hz QD OLED. Similar to other QD OLEDs in its performance, nothing unusual, nothing that we haven't seen before, but at a slightly higher refresh rate than some of the dirt cheap 240Hz models that we've seen throughout the year. Well calibrated, nice premium design, but no standout features, just a fairly typical QD OLED offering. The main reason why I really like the AW2725D is its $550 US price point, and sales did push it down to below $500 during Black Friday, making it a great value option, especially because it performs really well. So throughout a lot of this year, when we've sort of looked at that 1440p, 240, 280 Hz QD OLED category, for a lot of the year, those options were over $600 US. This model came in $550 US. It did create a little bit of a shakeup in the market and encouraged a lot of other brands to target $500 to $550, especially because those 240 Hz models, they can't be $550 when you've got a 280 Hz version available from Dell. This is also a really great value option in a lot of other regions, much more competitive than you would see in the US. So from that standpoint, I think it's quite similar to something like the AW2725Q. It takes the panel, it does a great job of its performance, and offers it at a great price point. So based on that, I'd put it into the A tier. I think it's probably better than the 272QPX50 and the M27UP. So I would be slotting it into this position in the A tier, a great value product if you did want a QD OLED with those specifications. Now, a very similar product that I also tested this year is the Gigabyte MO27Q2. This is a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz QD OLED, standard QD OLED experience, but maybe not as much HDR mode flexibility given the way that Gigabyte configures their HDR in the latest versions of their displays, so a bit of over-brightening in the Peak 1000 mode, which isn't ideal. It has a great design, so I really love the metal stand pillar and base that you get with these new updated Gigabyte M series monitors, fantastic sRGB mode, and some nice features, USB-C KVM switch. However, not as competitive as the AW2725D in price. So that monitor debuted at $550. This one debuted at $600 to $700 US and remains there today, despite being launched at a very similar time to the Dell model. So it's really difficult to recommend from that sense. And without any price movement, I probably wouldn't recommend it from that sense, but it's not a bad monitor and it's not as badly priced as something like a 322URX, which was hundreds of dollars more than it should be. This is probably just $50 to $100 more with typical prices compared to something like the AW2725D. That said, there were quite a number of other 1440p 240Hz QD OLEDs that hit $500 throughout this year. So again, $600 to $700, not as competitive. I think this is a C-tier monitor. That is probably how I would see it, probably towards the top of the C tier. So I'd place it above things like the 275QF, the Titan Army monitor, which, all these monitors had, one or two flaws with them, but one or two strengths as well. This is mostly a good monitor, just with, a price that wasn't overly competitive. Now again to some pretty exciting products from Asus. The Asus ROG Strix OLED XG32 UCWMG is first up, so 32-inch 4K 240Hz W OLED. This uses the same sort of panel that we saw last year on the 32-inch 4K W OLEDs, but with a big update for 2025, offering the true black glossy coating. So all of the previous 32-inch W OLEDs that we saw used a matte screen finish, but this monitor went with glossy, which I think is a pretty significant upgrade and offers a better screen finish better screen coating than you would see from QD OLEDs of a similar sort of size, resolution, and refresh rate. That's because the WOLED panels better handle ambient light, so you get deeper blacks in a wider range of conditions. They are a bit more reflective than some of those QD OLEDs, but overall I think this is a great product. It also offered some really strong features. Near proximity sensor was added into this design. It also added an updated design overall with a flat metal base. Excellent performance across the board. It offered the 1080p 480Hz dual mode as well, so that works really well. Exclusive feature to the WOLEDs that you don't get with QD OLEDs. So all of those things made it a really great quality monitor. Now, when I reviewed it, I was told it would be $950 US, which would have made it instantly the best 4K OLED on the market. This would have been the monitor to get. But the real price, when it actually debuted, was $1,100 US, which is okay, but makes it more expensive compared to QD OLEDs. So you could often get very similar specs from QD OLED for $900, whereas this WOLED is $1,100. And you know, it is better in some ways with the glossy finish, with the dual mode support, with better and more consistent HDR brightness, not having to deal with panel dimming, for example. However, the fact that it is $1,100 makes it a little harder to recommend. So is it an S-tier monitor? Probably. If it was $950, absolutely, that would have been a great buy. I think, though, with the way things have ended up, this is probably a top of A-tier product. Certainly would recommend it. Great product for people wanting that 4K OLED experience, but hasn't quite nailed the bang for buck value that I would expect from a flagship monitor. But then again, you know, for flagship products, if you were looking to spend over $900, could you spend $1,100? Maybe, in which case it's still, you know, highly recommendable. All right, next up we have the Asus ROG Strix OLED XG27AQ WMG, 27-inch 1440p 280Hz WOLED monitor here. And this was the first panel that I reviewed that uses the new primary RGB tandem 4th generation panel from LG Display. I think they've now renamed that to just tandem WOLED, but at the time, primary RGB tandem. So this really is the best 1440p 280Hz-ish OLED monitor. It's bright, offering up to 330 nits in SDR and 1400 nits in HDR, much more consistent HDR brightness than you would see from QD OLEDs with no panel dimming. It's well calibrated, strong feature set, wider color gamut. It's got the true black glossy finish, which I believe is better than the QD OLED glossy that you would get from 1440p QD OLEDs of a similar sort of price, and also had a wider color gamut than previous WOLED. So there was a lot of work that was put into this panel to make it more competitive with QD OLED offerings, and I think in many ways it is the better panel overall. So when I see something like, for example, the AW2725D that we reviewed earlier, $550 for very similar specs, I think the Asus XG27AQ WMG is a better overall product at its supposed MSRP of $600. So even though it is $50 more expensive than you would see from that Dell model and around $100 more expensive than we saw for some of the other lower cost models, the MSI and so forth, I think it is worth spending that money because it is a really high quality product that I said has a lot of strengths compared to some of those QD OLEDs. So I think this is an S-tier product, one of the best monitors that I reviewed throughout this year. Easy to recommend, easy to purchase. Well, it's actually not easy to purchase, but it should be, you know, quite a good value product if it was available for $600. The reason it's not easy to purchase is because of availability. In a lot of regions, you still can't buy it, which is a bit disappointing. Now, are there flaws to this monitor? Yes, in some sense, it is more reflective than QD OLEDs. It does have color banding issues and uniformity issues with dark gray, which is something that buyers of these primary RGB tandems and other WOLED monitors are running into. But generally speaking, I think those flaws are less significant than the flaws you get with QD OLED, like ambient light, black levels, panel dimming, that sort of thing. So overall, yeah, I think it is an S-tier product that is well worth buying. Next up, we have the MSI MAG273QP X24. So this is quite similar to the 271QPX E2. So same 27-inch 1440p 240Hz QD OLED. More basic design, emits USB-C, though it is very similar to the E2, and it is very similar to a couple of the other X24 variants that do exist. I think the $600 price that it debuted at, the MSRP, is quite underwhelming compared to the AW2725D, which has that slightly higher refresh rate and debuted at $500. But it was available for as low as $450 at some points during Black Friday sales, and generally you weren't often seeing it for $600. It was a little bit lower than that for quite a bit of the year. So based on that, I think it probably is better than the 271QPX E2. It does perform a little better from memory. It does have a lower price point. at a lot of times, and it is easier to purchase now than the E2 model. So I think I'm going to slot it in maybe ahead of the 2772URX, but below the G60SF. It is a good quality monitor. I think if it was more consistently available for, say, $500, for example, it would have been ahead of the AW2725D, but because of that fluctuating price, it was $600 at times, and it probably isn't as good of a monitor overall as the AW model. I think B tier makes sense. The Gigabyte MO27U2 is a very simple C tier monitor. The reason why I say this is that 27-inch 4K QD OLED, very similar to some of the other products we've been talking about, PG27U XG27U It does offer some features that some models don't have, so you do get USB-C and a KVM switch. It doesn't support Dolby Vision, no DisplayPort 2.1. It had acceptable but not outstanding calibration, limited HDR modes, pretty nice design. The main issue for me, the MSRP of it was simply too expensive at $1,000 US. Sales have brought it down to $700, which I think is definitely okay, quite competitively priced compared to the AW2725Q, but I'm not sure how long those sales will continue for. So if it does go back up to $1,000 like it has been for most of this year, it just isn't competitive compared to the Alienware model or the Asus model. So based on that, it's probably not as good as the 272URX that we put into the B tier, but that product was quite expensive at times. So I think for me, I'm probably going to put this at the top of the C tier for now. Probably a little better than the MO27Q2 in terms of its pricing, with the price having come down. So yeah, I think that's probably where it goes for now. Probably thinking about reassessing that 272URX at some point as well. Maybe that will move down into the C tier. Just because, yeah, I think I am going to move the 272URX down to the C tier just because of how expensive it was compared to something like, the MO27U2 for $700 is great. You just weren't necessarily getting that value at any point from the 272URX. So, yeah, let me make that adjustment. I think the C tier is probably a better position for that. Now we are on to the final set of monitors, starting with the Gigabyte M27Q3. This is a 27-inch 1440p 320Hz IPS LCD, which I think has great value as a high refresh rate monitor. It's increased in refresh rate to 320Hz from the usual 240Hz that we see from these sorts of products. It has variable overdrive with fast transition times, average calibration, contrast, and brightness, so not really doing anything unique there from an IPS LCD standpoint. It has an excellent design for a budget monitor using the new M series design from Gigabyte. You get USB-C and a KVM switch, which is excellent. And the $270 US price point is pretty good for this refresh rate. So I think if you were interested in an SDR LCD, you wanted a high refresh rate for multiplayer gaming, the M27Q3 is a product that can be recommended, similar to something like the M27UP. And I probably would recommend it over a lot of other options that offer similar specifications. It isn't S tier necessarily because, it doesn't have an outstanding feature set or outstanding performance. If this did have HDR support, for example, at around that sort of price point, S tier for sure. But I think for now, this is probably somewhere in the A tier, probably a little better than the M27UP, but towards the bottom of the A tier. Definitely a good quality monitor for people after something that is 1440p. And I am running out of space now in the A tier, but we'll see how things go with the rest of these products. So next up, we have the Gigabyte MO27Q28G. This is very similar to the XG27AQWMG, but it is actually available now, and it's priced at $600 US. We're not 100% sure whether the Asus model will be $600. They said it should be $600, but the Gigabyte model is definitely $600, and you can purchase it now. So the main difference between the Asus and the Gigabyte models, the Gigabyte model uses a matte screen coating instead of glossy, so probably not as good in my opinion, but still quite a capable monitor in all senses. Not as many features, but more than past Gigabyte monitors. So Gigabyte added the anti-flicker feature, that added black frame insertion to this monitor. So its feature set is quite competitive with the Asus model. It has great calibration, especially the sRGB mode, and in my opinion, an outstanding price relative to the QD OLEDs like I talked about previously. So in my opinion, this is an S-tier monitor as well. I think if we're talking about the cream of the crop 1440p monitors that were released throughout 2025, it would be the two primary RGB tandem models. I think these are really dominant products in their price range. I think a lot of people will be excited to purchase them in that sort of $600 US range, and I think as well, this has caused a lot of that price competition with QD OLEDs that have had to push down to $500 or even down to $450, $400 on sale, just because the QD OLED panel, in my opinion, is not as good. Brightness advantages, lots of other things with the primary RGB tandem panels. So there's that. Then we get to the MSI MPG2741LM E16M, the worst name monitor in this rankings by far. This is much better than previous mini LED panels. It does have 1152 zones, 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS LCD. Now, how I rank this one is difficult because it has unimpressive response times. I think MSI could have done a better job of calibrating this display to make it more in line with other 27-inch 4K products. It does have a 1080p 320Hz dual mode, which again is fine, but the response times aren't amazing in that particular mode. It has average calibration in the SDR mode. It is decent in the HDR mode and has some interesting HDR options. Great brightness and contrast in the HDR mode with that mini LED, full array local dimming backlight, excellent HDR experience, decent resolution for productivity, and it does have a great build quality. So all of those things, it does make it a product that is worth purchasing in some circumstances. However, it is on the pricier side as far as what we're seeing from these mini LED products at $500 US. Some of the other options are in the $400 to $450 range, making the MSI model not quite as attractive. And ultimately, would this be a B tier monitor like an AW3425DW? I think it's, if this was the only one of these that I had tested, so the only mini LED model using this new panel, it probably would have been B tier, but I think some of those other options are probably things I'd recommend over this, but it is good as well. So yeah, I don't know. I'm going to slot in the end of B tier for now, but we'll see how it goes once we start assessing some of those other monitors. Next up, we have the Lenovo Legion 27UD10, a monitor that I have not reviewed just yet, but I will be including this in a 27-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED roundup at some point in early 2026, so you will see the performance results from this monitor at some point. The reason why I haven't reviewed it is that there are performance issues in the HDR mode and some weird setting choices in the SDR configuration as well. I believe it does always enable sharpening in some settings, which is quite weird. So compared to other 27-inch monitors that use this QD OLED panel, it's just straight up a monitor that I couldn't recommend. Not because of pricing or anything like that. I mean, if it does become a super cheap monitor, which as far as I'm aware it isn't, then maybe you would consider it. But if you were after this sort of specification and you were after something that was good value, the Dell Alienware AW2725Q is just simply the monitor to get. So based on that, I would put it into probably the top of the E tier. It's probably not as bad as you would see from the PG27FFX2A or the 27G850. It's definitely better than the 27G850A, but yeah, just not a QD OLED I can recommend, which is interesting given that most of them are good. So there was certainly that. The Asus ROG Strix OLED XG32UCWG is very similar to the XG32UCWMG, but it's just 165Hz instead of 240Hz. So it's basically the exact same monitor, and it is cheaper, about $150 cheaper, but quite simply, it's not as good because of the lower refresh rate. So I think in this price range, most people would want to spend the extra money and just get the higher refresh rate model, but in some regions, it might be quite attractive in terms of its price. So to me, this is probably a top of the B tier product. So we are definitely running out of space in the A and B tiers, but it's a good product. It is worth buying. It does have all of those benefits of the true black glossy coating. The performance of the WOLED panels is good as well. So let's just slot that in there. And I think that does make sense. Tier below the 240Hz model. Next up, we have the AOC U27G4XM. So this is a very similar panel to the MSI model, the E16M that we talked about just before, but it's not as good in general. It has worse build quality, in my opinion, and a more limited port selection, so you don't get USB-C, for example. It does have better response time tuning than the MSI model and a more contrast-focused HDR optimization, but it's not as bright as the MSI model because of that. It doesn't offer some of the HDR settings that the MSI offers, and the feature set isn't amazing. So generally speaking, the MSI model is the better model, but the AOC is 20% cheaper, at least in Australia. So based on that, you could recommend it. You could buy this over the MSI model and be quite happy with it because of the price difference, but it's not as good. So I think this is quite simply a C tier monitor. Everything about its performance, its feature set screams C tier to me, and its pricing is pretty good. So I think towards the top of the C tier makes sense. I'm probably going to slot it in just in the middle here. We'll move some of these other monitors up. and we'll slot it in probably between the MO27U2 and the MO27Q2 based on pricing. I think that probably makes the most sense for that monitor. Next up, we have the Gigabyte M27Q2 QD. So this is a 27-inch 1440p 210Hz IPS LCD. So a little higher refresh rate than we normally see from this category of product, most of which are 165 or 180 Hz. This bumps it up to 210 Hz, which is always nice, but not a game changer. It does have good performance, so you get proper variable overdrive support with good response time tuning. It is able to produce a very wide gamut thanks to the quantum dot enhanced backlight, hence QD in the name. There's a high contrast ratio for an IPS LCD. It does have an unknown US price, but it is good value in Australia. It's a little cheaper than the M27Q3, but lower refresh rate. It's one of those products that's difficult to class from that sense, because I would imagine that it's going to be in most regions more expensive than something like the MSI 275QF as one of those budget 1440p choices, but it also performs better than that monitor, offers things like a height adjustable stand that you don't get from the MSI. So based on that, it's probably a C tier monitor, but probably towards the top of the C tier. Just depends on pricing again. Is it better than something like a U27G4XM? Probably, because of its value, is probably a better overall monitor in its class than you'd see from that AOC model. So I think I'll move some of these down and we'll slot in the AOC into the upper part of the C tier for me. So yeah, I mean, generally, if I was recommending people 1440p monitors, I'd be more likely to recommend the M27Q3 than the M27Q2 QD. So I think that makes sense. Next up, we've got the Asus ROG Swift PG27AQWP-W. So this is basically the same as the XG27AQWMG in the way that it has a primary RGB tandem panel, but just at a much higher refresh rate, 540 Hz compared to 280 Hz. It also offers dual mode support with up to a 720p 720 Hz. So the 720p aspect, is not amazing. You don't get the best clarity and text quality in that mode, but 720 Hz is unrivaled in an OLED at the moment, which makes it quite attractive from that sense. It has a great feature set, proximity sensor, anti-flicker DisplayPort 2.1, excellent factory tuning. It's very competitive with the 500 Hz QD OLEDs because it is a little brighter. It has a better screen coding, slightly higher refresh rate. The 720p 720 Hz dual mode is also available. So from that sense, I think it is the better monitor than the 272QP X50 overall. It's got fewer issues. So if you're after, let's say, the ultimate 1440p high refresh rate monitor, this would be it. But at the same time, it is very expensive at $1,100 US. So if you are purely after 1440p motion clarity for multiplayer gaming, the 272QP X50 or even the G60SF make a lot more sense because those are priced around $750. So that's quite a price saving compared to this monitor at $1,100. But if you wanted the best of the best, it is still this Asus model. So, how do I rank this, for example? I think it is far enough ahead of the 272QP X50 because of primary RGB tandem that I would put it into the S tier. So, for example, we've got in the A tier another great, WOLED glossy coating, the XG30UC WMG. I didn't put that in the S tier because its price wasn't overly competitive with QD OLEDs, but also the performance between that WOLED and the QD OLEDs was closer. Whereas with, I think this monitor, yes, the 272QP X50 gives you that brighter QD OLED experience. The PG27AQWP has the better screen coding that doesn't have the issues with ambient light reflectivity. It has no panel dimming issues in brighter HDR scenes. It has that 720 Hz mode. So yeah, I just think it is the better overall monitor. I think it is the better overall product. I think it's an S tier product. It's really quite a good monitor. And you do get that quite nice and unique silver semi-transparent design, which is quite attractive. So there's that as well. Couple more to go, starting with the KTC M27P6. So this is a 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS LCD that uses the same panel as the MSI E16M and the U27G4XM. So it has that same 1152 zone mini LED backlight. It is a more brightness-focused HDR implementation, so it's much brighter than the AOC model and a little bit brighter than the MSI as well. So it does have more additional blooming because of that, but it is brighter overall if that's something that you wanted. Great response time tuning across both the 4K and 1080p modes, notably better than the MSI model, but it does have a drawback, which is it's quite mediocre build quality. It has a decent price, $470 US, does go on sale to near $400 at times, which makes it better value than the MSI model, but the MSI does have some advantages. I think I do prefer the way the HDR looks on the E16M. It does give you a few more user adjustable modes, and the MSI model has a better feature set with a better build quality. So from that sense, it's probably towards the top of the C tier. I would have it above the U27G4XM. But yeah, I think its build quality, overall feature set, is it amazing in terms of putting into the B tier? Actually, it probably is a B tier monitor. It probably is a B tier monitor, just not as good as the MSI model. So I'll squeeze it on the end here. I'm sort of running out the end of our B tier. But yeah, I think it probably is a B tier if I'm being totally fair, because it is one of the better 4K mini LED products that I've tested. I think people will be quite happy with the HDR experience, and it is good value. So from that sense, yeah, it is quite good. So pretty evenly matched between those two models, but for different reasons. Like I said, the MSI is the overall better product, but more expensive, response time issues. The KTC model, better value, other considerations. The Dell Alienware AW3425DWM is a 34-inch 1440p, so 3440 by 1440, 21:9 aspect ratio ultra-wide with a 180Hz VA LCD panel. Now, it's quite an underwhelming product, if I'm being perfectly honest. The VA panel is not that different to models from a few years ago, aside from slightly better tuning from Dell with the more modern version. Great native contrast ratio, of course, but you do get issues like dark smearing and poor viewing angles. There's no HDR hardware support, so you're not getting as good a feature set as you would see from, like a 4K IPS LCD that's sort of a similar price. It's okay. It's nothing special. I'm in two minds about this one, because if you're talking about like a low-cost ultra-wide monitor, these are the sorts of panels you're getting. And so the Dell model is quite competitive from that sense. It's around $400 to $350 US, which is okay value, but it's not doing anything amazing to me. And I think just the panel quality overall is just not that good, which makes it kind of hard to recommend from that sense. So I'm kind of in two minds about it. If you came to me and you're like, I want a budget ultra-wide, again, I'd probably recommend the DWM because it's one of the better VAs that are available in that price range, but there's no real alternatives. And then also it's not that great of a panel. So I think this is probably top of the D tier for mine. Yeah, it's just not great, underwhelming performance. I would have liked to see a bit more progress in the budget ultra-wide space, maybe more of those IPS panels, but we're just not getting that at the moment, in which case, it's okay, but yeah, it's just not doing all that much for me. And the final product that I'll be ranking is the Koorui S2741LM. So this is another 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS with the 1152 zone mini LED backlight, making it similar to the E16M, M27P6, and also the U27G4XM. It's pretty similar to the other models, but in a way less good value because it's often priced at $600 US, which is more than the MSI model at about $500, the KTC at just below $500, and the AOC, which is below both of those again. But it does have a great balance of everything across things like response times, which are better than the MSI model and quite well tuned. It's got good calibration, nothing amazing, but it's good. Good HDR accuracy. It's got good brightness. The build quality is better than the KTC model and pretty good in general, but it's not outstanding in any areas. Like I'm not pointing to it going, okay, it's got some nice unique HDR modes like the MSI model, or it has the lowest price like the AOC model, or even the KTC model is a little better tuned for response times in some areas. So, it's a good monitor, but how would I rank it compared to the MSI model, the KTC model? It's probably pretty similar to those KTC products. I think the price probably knocks it down a bit. Like, for example, would I recommend this model over the KTC if they were at their current prices, where the KTC is below $450 US and this is like $500 plus? Probably not. They're probably a bit too similar for me. But, if they were the same price, I'd probably get the Koorui over the KTC model, maybe. But again, they're so similar. So it's really hard to rank it. I think this is probably a top of the C tier stack for me. It's a better monitor than the AOC, even though the AOC model is cheaper. So that is a factor. But yeah, in general, I think I would have it top of C tier compared to some of these other products. So let's just make that shift and we'll see how things are stacking up. Okay, so now we have the final tier list in place with all of the monitors that I have tested this year. And as you can see, there's a number of products in the C and B tiers, which do dominate. Now, part of that is because I do generally select monitors to review that I think have something compelling or something interesting to offer buyers. So I'm not usually out there selecting, for example, low-cost 1440p LCDs that I think are really poor value to test. Not a lot of reason for me to do that. And if I did, you would see a lot more products in the D and E tiers. Now, I think based on this assessment, I am going to move the 27G850A back down to the F tier. It is the worst monitor that I reviewed this year, and I think it does deserve to be in the F tier. It is a fail with the specifications that it was offering what it could have been. I really don't like that product. Whereas, the other two monitors in here are just, they're mediocre, not worth recommending, but they're not bad. Like, I don't want to call this a flawed monitor because it's not flawed, but it's just not good. So there's that. So yeah, lots of monitors ended up being in the C tier. So if we assess across what we're sort of putting things into the C tier for, it's usually either they're a great panel, but a poor price. So that could be 272URX, for example, or just a mediocre price like MO27U2, MO27Q2. And then you've got the weaker products in terms of performance, but at better prices. So 275QF, I think, counts for that. M32UP, P2510S, for example, U27G4XM, and then, the S2741LM in there as well in that sort of category. So there's two ways you can sort of go there with C tier. I think they're just average products. Okay, they're fine. The D tier, these are the sort of products that I think will probably be on the egregious end of pricing. The 322URX and G81SF, as I mentioned, they were well over $1,000 for a lot of the year. That makes them just far too expensive, even though in general, the panel quality on both of those is really good. So for example, is the 322URX a better 4K monitor than the M32UP? Absolutely it is. Better quality, better panel. The OLED panel is better. Similar, is it better than some of the 4K mini LEDs? Absolutely. But the M32UP is only a $500 monitor, which is pretty good for a 4K IPS LCD. The 320URX is a poor QD OLED that you wouldn't buy because it was way too expensive. So that's why those products are in the D tier. Then when you move up a little bit further, the B tier, these are all the products that are pretty good, have strengths. They're not necessarily outstanding monitors, but they're products that you could recommend for one reason or another. So if you wanted a lower cost 4KW OLED, the XG30UCWG fits that bill. If you wanted a really great ultra-wide but with some drawbacks, the 45GX950A is a great product. The Q27G40XMN, as we've talked about, has some problems, but is a good monitor in general. And you can go on with the rest of the products that we're talking about here. And then when we get to the higher tiers, these are products that generally I think are worth recommending for one reason or another and offer good performance across the board, good feature sets, and or really attractive prices. The S tier, of course, being the absolute cream of the crop from this year, which I think personally are those primary RGB tandem W OLEDs. In fact, all three of the primary RGB tandem monitors are in that S tier. Good pricing on them, except for the 540Hz model, which is quite expensive, but certainly these other two models from Asus and Gigabyte, very good quality, very good pricing. The PG27AQWP is the ultimate 1440p monitor, which is why it makes it into the S tier. And then the rest of these, if you bought XG30UCWMG, great monitor, you should be happy with it. PG27UCDM, great monitor. The Alienware model, really good value. The XG27UCDMG variant, good value. The AW2725D, great value QD OLED. The X50, great value for 500Hz gaming if you want that. And then we've got some LCDs rounding out the pack that are good value as well. So I think that's a pretty good tier list that I'm happy with. I'm happy with the positioning of these products. Did make a couple of adjustments as we go. I dropped the 272URX down. I dropped the 27G850 down as well. But in general, I think I'm pretty happy with that. So those are the official rankings of the monitors that I've tested in 2025. And yeah, that does it for this video. Now, it may not seem like a ton of work goes into ranking these monitors because I'm just sitting here in front of the camera off script, just going on about the features and quality of all of these different monitors. But I did genuinely test all 35 of them throughout the year. So in a sense, this monitor video takes a lot of effort because we actually have to test everything, go through and make reviews and assess all the products to even begin ranking them. So we do appreciate everyone, especially people that watch these videos right to the end. We do appreciate people who support us on Patreon so that we can continue reviewing products and giving all the recommendations and guides and ranking a ton of monitors at the end of the year like this. So if you sign up to Patreon, not only are you supporting Monitors Unboxed and the testing that we do, but you also get access to some cool benefits. So with the majority of monitors that you see on the screen with the tier list, we have ICC profiles for them. A couple of them don't have ICC profiles just because you don't need them for those monitors. We also have the calibrated settings database for all of the products. So you can go through and see the settings that we recommend for all of these monitors. You also get access to our Discord community, great place to chat about monitors and get further recommendations. So that's all available for people if you sign up to Patreon, and we really do thank everyone who is a Patreon member who supports this channel directly and allows us to test products and make these ranking videos. So that'll do it for this one. Very long video. It's going to be interesting to edit. I think I've been going for nearly an hour and a half, so appreciate everyone that watches to the end. But until the next one, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you for more monitor testing in 2026.